Welcome to David's Stories. Today we follow Leo Morgan, a 71-year-old tycoon humiliated by his daughter's fiancé, who reclaims his dignity, exposes greed, and defends his legacy. Subscribe and hit the bell for weekly tales of honor and truth. Share your thoughts below. Let's start the story. The air in the azure ballroom shimmered with an unnatural glow, as if the chandeliers above were not merely crystal, but prisms of captured starlight. The scent of wealth clung to every surface, polished marble floors, velvet drapes, and champagne flutes that sang with each clink. I stood in the shadowed corner of this gilded cage, a 71-year-old ghost in a world I had forged with my own hands. My name is Leo Morgan, and though my suit was old, its creases pressed with the precision of a man who knows his worth, I felt the weight of eyes upon me. Not eyes of admiration, but of pity, disdain, and something darker, calculation. They saw a relic, a worn-out husk in a threadbare jacket. They didn't see the man who held the keys to this palace of light and lies. My daughter Chloe floated through the crowd like a wisp of moonlight, her white gown trailing behind her as if woven from dreams. She was radiant, but her smile flickered fragile as a candle in a storm. I knew that look. Isabella, her mother, had worn it once, when the world pressed too hard against her heart. Chloe's fiancé, Preston Vanderbilt, moved beside her, a predator in a tailored suit, his smile all teeth and ambition. His eyes, sharp as obsidian blades, cut through the room, landing on me, with the kind of contempt you reserve for something you've scraped off your shoe. To him, I was an inconvenience, a smudge on the perfect canvas he was painting for himself. To me, he was a thief, stealing not just my daughter, but the legacy I had built with blood, sweat, and secrets. The Azure Ballroom was no ordinary place. Decades ago, I had poured my soul into its creation, not just as a builder, but as a dreamer who saw beauty in structure, strength in silence. Morgan Construction. My empire had raised this monument from the earth, its walls whispering stories of my triumphs and losses. Yet tonight I stood apart, a stranger in my own creation. The clinking glasses mocked me, their delicate chimes like the laughter of forgotten gods. I clutched the edge of my glass, the cool crystal grounding me, as I watched Preston glide through the crowd, his arm around Chloe. Not with love, but with possession. A cold knot twisted in my gut, a warning from some primal instinct I had long buried. I am no ordinary man, though I wear the guise of one. Years ago, I learned to wield power not with flash or fanfare, but with the quiet precision of a chess master moving pieces across a board no one else could see. My wealth was not just in gold or steel, but in knowledge, the kind that could topple empires or raise them from dust. I had chosen a life of simplicity, retreating to a timber house by a lake where the ghosts of my past whispered in the creak of every floorboard. But simplicity is a mask, and beneath it lies a fortress of secrets. Preston, with his smug grin and calculated cruelty, had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he could break me, humiliate me, erase me. He was wrong. The evening unfolded like a play I had seen too many times, each act scripted with betrayal. The MC's voice cut through the hum of the crowd, calling for the father of the bride. The spotlight found me, its beam harsh and unyielding, pinning me like a specimen under glass. A ripple of polite applause followed, hesitant, as if the guests were unsure whether I belonged on this stage. I walked forward, my old bones protesting, but my steps steady, each one a defiance of the whispers that trailed me. Who is that man? Chloe's father, I think. Some old contractor. Poor thing, he looks out of place. Their words were knives, but I had been cut deeper before. I reached the microphone, my hands steady despite the storm brewing inside me. The room quieted, 300 pairs of eyes watching, waiting for the old man to fumble. I had no grand speech prepared, no flowery words to match the opulence around me. I spoke from the heart, my voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of a lifetime. Chloe, I began, my eyes finding her in the sea of faces. I held you in my arms the day you were born, a tiny spark of light in a world that felt too big. I've watched you grow, stumble, shine. My only wish is for you to have a life filled with laughter, kindness, and a partner who sees the treasure you are, even if it's just a fraction of how I see you." My voice cracked just for a moment as I thought of Isabella, her absence a wound that never healed. "I love you always." The applause that followed was warm, genuine, a brief flicker of humanity in this cold theater of wealth. But then Preston stepped forward, his slow, mocking clap slicing through the moment like a blade. "Well said, Pops," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "A real tearjerker. Now let's get to the fun part." The crowd laughed a nervous, complicit chuckle, as if they sensed the cruelty beneath his charm, but chose to ignore it. I saw Chloe's smile falter, her eyes darting to me then away, as if she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. The fun part was the cake, a 7-tiered monstrosity of white frosting and sugar flowers, a monument to excess that cost more than most people's homes. Chloe and Preston cut the first slice, their hands entwined, for the cameras, a picture of manufactured bliss. But then Preston turned not to her, but to me. His smirk was a serpent's, his eyes glinting with malice. "You look like you could use a good meal, Pops," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Before I could react, his hand shot out, seizing the back of my head. The world tilted, and my face met the cake with a sickening crunch, the cold, greasy frosting filling my nostrils, my mouth, my soul. The room erupted not in gasps but in laughter, a cruel cacophony led by Preston's friends, their voices sharp as shattered glass. He pulled my head back, my face a grotesque mask of cream and crumbs, and leaned in close, his whisper venomous. "Try some dessert, beggar." The word hung in the air, a curse that silenced the laughter, replacing it with a suffocating stillness. Chloe stood frozen, her face a canvas of horror, her hands trembling but her voice silent. In that moment I wasn't just humiliated, I was erased, reduced to a caricature in my own daughter's eyes. But something stirred within me, something ancient and unyielding. It wasn't just anger, it was power, the kind that had built skyscrapers and broken men far stronger than Preston Vanderbilt. I felt it rise, a tide of resolve that had lain dormant for too long. The room thought they saw a broken old man, but they were blind to the truth. I was no beggar. I was Leo Morgan, architect of empires, keeper of secrets, and tonight I would begin to unravel the lies that bound this stage. As the laughter died, a voice cut through the silence, deep and resonant, like thunder rolling across a distant plain. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" It was Henry Harrison, a titan whose name could open any door in this city. His eyes burned with fury, not at Preston, but for me. He pointed a finger not at the groom, but at the man they called a beggar. "That man is Leo Morgan," he boomed, his voice shaking the chandeliers. "He doesn't just own a few buildings. He owns half this city, including the ground you're standing on." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that shifted the air itself. Preston's face drained of color, his smugness replaced by confusion, then terror, as if he'd just glimpsed a shadow he couldn't comprehend. The guests whispered, their eyes darting between us, sensing a mystery unraveling before them. I stood still, my face still smeared with frosting, but my heart steady, my mind sharp. This was no longer a wedding, it was a reckoning. I wiped a smear of cream from my cheek, my movements slow, deliberate. The crowd watched, waiting for the old man to crumble. But I didn't crumble. I straightened my shoulders, squaring my eyes, meeting Preston's, with a cold, unyielding gaze. "You've made a mistake, boy," I said softly, my voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "And soon you'll learn just how costly it is." The azure ballroom, with its glittering lights and whispered secrets, was no longer just a venue. It was a battlefield, and I was no mere guest. I was its architect, its master. And tonight I would begin to reclaim what was mine, not just my dignity, but the truth. The game had begun, and Preston Vanderbilt had no idea what forces he had awakened. The azure ballroom pulsed with a life of its own, its walls humming with secrets older than the guests who filled it. The chandeliers above flickered not with faulty wiring, but with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my heart. I stood at the edge of the stage, at my brief speech as father of the bride still echoing in the air, its sincerity swallowed by the glittering void of this place. The applause had been warm, a fleeting moment of connection, in a room that thrived on pretense. But I knew it wouldn't last. Preston Vanderbilt, the man who had claimed my daughter's hand, was not one to let vulnerability linger. He thrived on control, and I was the one piece of his perfect puzzle that refused to fit. Chloe stood near the towering cake, a seven-tiered monstrosity of white frosting and sugar flowers that gleamed like a frozen waterfall under the lights. Her gown shimmered, but her eyes betrayed her. A storm of doubt clouded their once bright spark. Preston, impeccable in his tailored tuxedo, moved beside her, his movements sleek and predatory like a panther circling its prey. The crowd watched them entranced as if they were the stars of a fairy tale. But I saw the truth. This was no love story. It was a transaction, and I was the inconvenient clause he intended to erase. The MC's voice boomed again, calling for the traditional cake cutting. The guests turned their faces alight with anticipation, cameras flashing like fireflies in the dim glow. Chloe and Preston stepped forward, their hands entwined over the silver knife, a picture of unity for the photographer's lens. The blade sliced through the cake with a soft, wet sound, and a cheer rose from the crowd. I watched from my corner, my hands clasped behind my back, my face a mask of calm. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing, a premonition that something was about to shift. Preston raised the first slice, a perfect wedge, dripping with cream, and held it up for the crowd to admire. The guests clapped, their laughter bright and artificial. Then his eyes found me. They weren't just cold. They were cruel, glinting with a malice that felt older than the man himself, as if some dark force had taken root behind his gaze. "Pops," he called, his voice loud and mocking, cutting through the chatter like a whip. "You look like you could use a good meal." The room stilled, sensing the shift from celebration to something sharper, more dangerous. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze, my own eyes steady, though my heart pounded with a rhythm that matched the strange pulse of the ballroom. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity tinged with unease. Preston's smirk widened a serpent's grin, and before I could brace myself, his hand shot out, seizing the back of my head with a grip like iron. The world tilted, and time seemed to slow, the air thickening as if the room itself held its breath. My face met the cake with a sickening crunch, the cold, greasy frosting smothering my senses, filling my nostrils, coating my tongue, seeping into my very soul. The impact wasn't just physical. It was a violation, a deliberate stripping of my dignity in front of 300 witnesses. The frosting was cloying, its sweetness a mockery of the bitterness rising in my chest. The room erupted, not in gasps of shock, but in roars of laughter led by Preston's entourage, his friends, his allies, a pack of hyenas reveling in my humiliation. Their voices clawed at me, each chuckle a blade carving away at the man I had been. I felt the weight of their eyes, their judgment, their delight in my fall. Chloe stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. Her silence was a wound deeper than the laughter. Preston pulled my head back, my face now a grotesque canvas of cream and crumbs, the remnants of the $7,000 cake clinging to my skin like a shroud. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, his whisper venomous and meant for the nearby tables to hear. "Try some dessert, beggar." The word landed like a curse, its weight heavier than the frosting, heavier than the laughter. It was a declaration of war, a signal that he intended to erase me not just from this moment, but from Chloe's life, from the legacy I had built with Isabella. The laughter began to fade, replaced by a thick, suffocating stillness. The air in the ballroom grew heavy, the chandeliers dimming slightly, as if the light itself recoiled from the cruelty. I stood there, my face smeared, my suit stained, but something within me stirred a spark, a flicker of the power I had buried long ago. It wasn't just anger, It was something older, deeper, a force that had built empires and toppled foes. I felt it uncoil, slow and deliberate, like a dragon waking from a long slumber. Before I could act, a voice cut through the silence, deep and resonant, like the tolling of a bell in a forgotten cathedral. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The words were a thunderclap, shaking the room to its core. It was Henry Harrison, a man whose name carried the weight of mountains, a developer whose influence rivaled my own in the days when we carved this city from dreams and steel. He stood at the far end of the ballroom, his broad frame silhouetted against the golden light, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to draw the very shadows closer. The crowd turned, their whispers rising like a tide. Henry's presence was a force, his voice a weapon honed by decades of command. He pointed a finger not at Preston but at me, his gesture sharp and unyielding. "That beggar," he boomed, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "is Leo Morgan. He founded Morgan Construction. He doesn't just own a few buildings, you arrogant little fool. He owns half this city, including the ground you're standing on." The revelation landed like a lightning strike, splitting the room in two. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of murmurs, frantic and disbelieving. Eyes that had mocked me now widened with shock, darting between me and Preston, who stood frozen, his face draining of color. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of confusion, then terror, as if he'd just glimpsed a truth too vast to comprehend. His mouth opened and closed, no sound escaping, a fish gasping on dry land. That's a joke, right?" he stammered, his voice cracking, desperate for someone to laugh to restore his crumbling facade. "A very funny, very expensive joke. Pops tell them." But I was no longer Pops. I was Leo Morgan, and the man they thought they knew was a shadow I had crafted to test the world's worth. I reached into my jacket pocket, my movements slow, deliberate, and pulled out a white handkerchief, its edges embroidered with Isabella's initials, a relic of a love that had shaped me. The crowd watched, their breaths held as I began to wipe the frosting from my face. I cleaned my eyebrows, my nostrils, my lips, each motion precise, unhurried, a ritual of reclamation. The frail, stooped posture I had worn like a cloak fell away. I stood straighter, my shoulders squared, my eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. Preston saw the change, and it unnerved him more than Henry's words. His panic deepened, his hands trembling as he pointed at Henry, then at me. "He's lying!" he shrieked, his voice high and brittle. "A child caught in a lie. He's a senile old man, and so is this one." He gestured wildly at me, his composure shattering like glass. "He's a broke, pathetic old fool who lives in a shack. Tell them, Chloe. Tell them he's lying." Chloe sat at the head table, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. She didn't speak, didn't defend me, didn't defend him. Her silence was a blade cutting deeper than Preston's words, deeper than the laughter. It was the silence of complicity, of a daughter who had chosen a hollow man over the father who had built her world. I folded the soiled handkerchief, tucking it back into my pocket, and met Preston's gaze. My voice when I spoke was low, steady, a blade of its own. "Preston," I said, my tone carrying the weight of a storm about to break, "you've made a significant miscalculation." The ballroom seemed to pulse again, the air growing heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting for what came next. The guests were no longer laughing. They were watching, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, sensing that they were witnessing the unraveling of a carefully woven lie. Henry stood firm, his presence a bulwark at my side, but I didn't need his protection. Not yet. The power I had buried was rising, and with it came a clarity that cut through the chaos like a beacon. I stepped forward, my shoes clicking softly on the marble floor, each step a declaration. The crowd parted slightly, instinctively, as if they could sense the shift in the air. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You think you know me?" I said, my words directed at Preston, but meant for the room. "You think you can break me with a cake and a word, but you don't know the half of it. This ballroom, this city, this moment, they're mine. And before this night is over, you'll understand exactly what that means. Preston's eyes widened his panic now, a living thing clawing at his composure. He looked to his friends, to the guests, searching for an ally, but found only curiosity and doubt. The chandeliers flickered again, their light casting strange shadows across his face, as if the ballroom itself was judging him. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a certainty that this was only the beginning. The Azure Ballroom was more than a venue. It was a stage, and I was its architect, its director, its master. Preston had thought to cast me as the fool, but the script was about to change. Somewhere in the distance beyond the walls of this glittering prison, I felt Isabella's presence, her strength flowing through me like a river. She had always believed in me, had seen the man beneath the empire, the heart beneath the steel. This was her legacy as much as mine, and I would not let it be tarnished by a man who saw love as a ledger. The crowd waited breathless as the air grew thick with anticipation. Henry's eyes met mine, a silent promise of loyalty, a reminder that I was not alone. But I didn't need reminding. I was Leo Morgan, and I was ready to show them all what that name truly meant. The storm was coming, and I would be its architect. The Azure Ballroom was silent now, save for the faint hum that seemed to emanate from its very walls, a pulse that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The guests' whispers had faded, their eyes still darting between me and Preston, who stood like a statue, his face pale as the frosting that still clung to my skin. I stood tall, the handkerchief folded neatly in my pocket, my gaze locked on the man who thought he could bury me with a single cruel act. But he didn't know me, not the real me. He saw a frail old man, a shadow in a worn suit. He didn't see the architect of empires, the keeper of secrets, the man who had built this city from dreams and defiance. To understand what was coming, to grasp the storm I was about to unleash, one had to know my story, a story written in concrete steel and the blood of a love lost too soon. I was not born to wealth. I was born to a small, drafty house on the edge of a city that chewed up dreamers and spat them out. My father was a bricklayer, his hands calloused and cracked, his back bent from years of hauling stone. My mother stitched dresses for women who lived in houses we could only imagine. But they gave me something no money could buy: a fire in my soul, a refusal to accept the world as it was. I was 16 when I first picked up a hammer, not to build a wall, but to tear one down to make way for something greater. That was the beginning of Morgan Construction. Though it wasn't a company then, just a boy with a vision and hands that refused to stay idle. By 25, I was no longer a boy. I was a force, a young man who ate blueprints for breakfast and slept with the roar of construction sites in my ears. Morgan Construction wasn't just a business, it was my rebellion against a world that told me I wasn't enough. I built skyscrapers that kissed the clouds, bridges that spanned rivers like threads of steel, and buildings that stood as testaments to what a man could do when he refused to bow. Each project was a battle fought against union bosses, corrupt officials, and competitors who thought they could outmaneuver me. They never did. I had a gift not just for engineering, but for seeing the invisible lines that connected power, money, and ambition. I learned to read men, like I read blueprints, spotting their weaknesses, their greed, their fears. But the true cornerstone of my life wasn't steel or concrete. It was Isabella. I met her on a muddy construction site, the future home of the Grand Majestic Hotel. She was a journalist there to cover the groundbreaking. Her notebook clutched against a wind that whipped her hair into a storm of auburn curls. She wore a hard hat too big for her head, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a smile that stopped my world. "You're building something special here, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice warm but sharp like sunlight cutting through fog. "But what's it for?" I didn't have an answer then, not one that satisfied her. But she stayed asking questions, challenging me, seeing me not the builder, not the ambition, but the man. Isabella became my compass, my reason. We married in a small ceremony by the lake in a timber house I built with my own hands, each beam a promise, each nail a vow. That house wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary, a place where the world's noise couldn't reach us. We dreamed of growing old there, of filling it with laughter and children. Chloe was born a year later as a tiny spark of light who carried her mother's smile and my stubborn heart. For a time, we were untouchable. My empire grew, my name became synonymous with power, and our home by the lake was a haven where love was the only currency that mattered. But the world has a way of breaking what you build. Isabella fell ill when Chloe was 10, a shadow creeping into her body that no doctor could banish. Cancer stole her piece by piece, her light dimming, but never fading. I fought it the only way I knew how, with money, with influence, with sheer will. I flew her to specialists across the globe, built a hospital wing in her name. Prayed to gods I didn't believe in. But some battles can't be won. She died in our timber house, her hand in mine, her last words a whisper. Protect our girl, Lee, protect her heart. Her death shattered me. The mansion I owned overlooking the city I had conquered became a hollow shell. The cars, the clubs, the endless stream of invitations, they were nothing, meaningless trinkets in a world without her. I stood in that empty mansion surrounded by wealth and realized it was a lie. Money couldn't fill the void she left. It couldn't bring her back, so I made a choice, one that would define the rest of my life. I sold everything. The mansion, the cars, the shares in ventures that no longer mattered. I kept Morgan Construction, but I handed its reins to a board. I trusted men and women who understood the vision Isabella and I had shared. I retreated to the timber house by the lake, the one I had built for her. It wasn't just a house. It was a reliquary, each floorboard soaked in her laughter, each window framing a memory of her smile. I lived simply not because I was poor, but because I was done with the lies wealth told. The world saw an old man in a flannel shirt driving a 15-year-old pickup truck with a scratch on the dashboard from the time Isabella dropped her wedding ring. They saw failure, poverty, a man who had faded into obscurity. They were wrong. Simplicity was my shield, my test. It was how I measured the worth of those who crossed my path, especially those who sought to claim my daughter's heart. That truck, that house, those worn clothes, they weren't signs of defeat. They were my armor, my testament. The truck's passenger seat was molded to Isabella's shape from the thousands of miles we drove, her hand resting on my leg, her fingers tapping to jazz on the radio. The leather jacket I wore bore a scar from a rebar at the Liberty Tower site, a day when Isabella wiped dust from my cheek and said she was proud of the city I was building. These were not relics of a lost life. They were medals of a war well fought, a life well lived. Chloe understood that once. As a child, she'd climb into the truck, her head barely clearing the window, giggling that it smelled like Dad. But then Preston Vanderbilt entered her life, and the world I had built for her began to crack. Preston was a predator cloaked in charm, a man who saw people as assets, not souls. I watched him weave his spell over Chloe, his promises of wealth and status blinding her to the values we had raised her with. She began to see my life through his eyes, my truck, my house, my simplicity as embarrassments, not treasures. The first crack came on a Sunday, her voice hesitant over the phone. Dad, some of my friends were asking, why don't you get a more respectable car? The word respectable was a dagger, not hers but his, planted in her mouth. It was the first time she saw my memories as junk, my choices as failures. I let it happen. I let her drift, believing she would find her way back. I let Preston reveal himself, his contempt growing bolder with each visit. He'd walk into my home, wiping his feet as if stepping into a barn, his eyes scanning my study with disdain. Still listening to that funeral music, Pops, he'd say, smirking at my jazz records. He wasn't just dismissing me, he was trying to erase me, to make me irrelevant in my daughter's eyes. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because I was watching, waiting. I had learned long ago that true power lies in patience, in seeing the board before moving the pieces. But there was more to my silence than strategy. There was a mystery I had guarded since Isabella's death, a secret woven into the very fabric of my life. When she died, I discovered something extraordinary about the world we had built together. The timber house wasn't just a home, it was a conduit, a place where the veil between the living and the lost was thin. On quiet nights when the lake reflected the stars, I could feel her presence, a whisper in the wind, a warmth in the air. It wasn't grief's illusion, it was real, a gift she had left me, though I didn't understand its full power then. I began to notice patterns, synchronicities, numbers on blueprints, aligning in impossible ways, deals closing with an ease that defied logic. It was as if Isabella's spirit guided me, her love, a silent partner in every decision. This gift came with a responsibility. I vowed to protect Chloe not just from men like Preston, but from a world that valued wealth over worth. I created the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust, a fortress of paper and law designed to shield our wealth from vultures. I lived on a modest stipend, not because I needed to, but to test those who entered our lives. Would they see a father, a man with a lifetime of wisdom, or just an old man with a potential inheritance? Preston failed that test spectacularly, his greed, a beacon that lit up every flaw in his soul. As I stood in the azure ballroom, the frosting still clinging to my face, I felt that presence again. Isabella not just a memory, but a force. The chandeliers flickered their light, bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if she were watching, waiting. I wasn't just a man humiliated before a crowd. I was a guardian of a legacy, a wielder of a power Preston couldn't fathom. He thought he had broken me, but he had only awakened me. The handkerchief in my pocket embroidered with her initials was more than a relic, it was a talisman, a reminder of the promises I had made. Henry Harrison's voice still echoed in the room, his revelation hanging like a storm cloud. Preston's panic was palpable, his eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist. The guests were restless, their whispers growing into a hum that matched the ballroom's pulse. I felt the weight of their stares, but I didn't waver. I had built this place not just with steel and stone, but with a vision that transcended the physical. The Azure Ballroom was a monument to my love for Isabella, and tonight it would be the stage for my reckoning. I took a step forward, the marble floor, cool beneath my feet, and the air seemed to shift, the shadows deepening around me. "You've underestimated me, Preston," I said, my voice low but resonant, carrying a power that silenced the murmurs. "You've underestimated this place, this moment, and the woman whose memory lives in every stone." The crowd leaned in, sensing something larger than a wedding, something ancient and unstoppable. I felt Isabella's presence stronger, now her strength flowing through me, a river of resolve that would not be dammed. This was no longer about a cake, a word, or a single act of cruelty. It was about a legacy, a love, and a power that Preston could never touch. He had thought to cast me as the fool, but the play was mine to direct. The storm was gathering, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the lies and build something true in their place. The Azure Ballroom's pulse lingered in my ears, a faint thrum that seemed to echo the ache in my chest. The guests' whispers had settled into a low hum, their eyes still flickering between me and Preston, who stood like a cornered animal, his bravado crumbling under Henry Harrison's revelation. The frosting on my face had dried into a sticky mask, but I stood unbowed, my gaze steady, the weight of my resolve anchoring me to the marble floor. The room thought they had seen the climax of this drama, but they were wrong. This was merely the opening act, and the true story, the one that had brought me to this moment, was written in the slow, painful unraveling of my bond with Chloe. My daughter, my light now dimmed by the shadow of a man who saw her as a prize to be won. Chloe sat at the head table, her face still buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved to defend me, when Preston smeared my dignity across that $7,000 cake. Her silence was louder than the laughter, sharper than his venomous whisper of beggar. It was a silence that cut deeper than any blade, because it wasn't just absence, it was surrender. Once she had been my partner in dreams, the girl who climbed into my old pickup truck and laughed at the world with me. Now she was a stranger, her heart swayed by a man who measured love in dollars and status. To understand how we came to this moment, I had to trace the cracks in our foundation, the slow erosion of the bond we had built, with Isabella's love as our cornerstone. It began subtly, like the first drop of rain before a storm. Chloe was 25 when Preston entered her life, a whirlwind of charm and promises that swept her away from the quiet truths of our world. She had always been bright, fierce, with her mother's smile and a curiosity that made her question everything. As a child, she'd sit on the floor of my study, her tiny fingers tracing the lines of my blueprints, asking why the buildings I designed reached for the sky. "Because they dream, sweetheart," I'd tell her, and she'd laugh, her eyes sparkling with the belief that anything was possible. We'd drive to the lake in my old truck, the one with the scratched dashboard, and she'd lean out the window, her hair catching the wind, shouting that she could smell the stars. But Preston changed her. Not all at once, but in small, insidious ways, like a poison seeping into the roots of a tree. The first sign came on a Sunday afternoon, her voice crackling through the phone with a hesitancy I didn't recognize. "Dad," she said, her words careful, rehearsed. "Some of my friends were asking, why don't you get a more respectable car?" The word respectable landed like a stone in my gut. Not because it hurt, but because it wasn't her. It was his voice. His judgment slipped into her mouth like a script. I laughed it off, told her the truck was part of me, like the house, like her mother's memory. But her silence on the other end told me she didn't understand, not anymore. I should have seen it then, the first crack in the foundation we had built. But love is blind, and a father's love is the blindest of all. I told myself it was a phase, that she'd come back to the values we'd raised her with: honesty, integrity, the belief that worth lies in the heart, not the wallet. I was wrong. The calls began to change, her voice growing distant, her requests sharper, more urgent. "Dad, I need $200 for a dress," she said one day, her tone casual but tinged with embarrassment. "There's a work event and I need to look the part." I sent the money, no questions asked, because that's what fathers do. But a week later it was $5,000 for a deposit on a trip to Aspen. "Preston says it's an incredible networking opportunity," she explained, and the word Preston was a bell tolling in my mind. It wasn't her need, it was his. The requests grew, a trickle becoming a flood. $1,000 for a charity gala table where Preston wanted to be seen. $10,000 for a down payment on a luxury sedan, because, as she stammered, "Preston says my old Honda is humiliating." Each time I transferred the money, I felt a piece of her slip away, as if she were trading her soul for his approval, one designer handbag at a time. She thought she was draining my meager retirement savings, and I let her believe it. I let them both believe it because I wanted to see how far they would go, how deep their greed ran. It was a test, one I had designed long ago, but it was breaking my heart to watch it unfold. Preston's contempt grew bolder with each dollar I sent. He'd stride into my timber house, his polished shoes clicking on the floorboards I'd laid with my own hands, and make a show of wiping his feet, as if the place were a barn unfit for his presence. "Still listening to that funeral music, Pops," he'd say, gesturing to my jazz records, his smirk a blade aimed at my dignity. During the rare family dinners Chloe still attended, he'd interrupt my stories, tales of building the city of Isabella's laughter, with boasts about his stock portfolio, or condescending lectures on tech trends, as if I were a child who couldn't grasp the modern world. He wasn't just dismissive. He was deliberate, calculated, trying to paint me as a relic, a doddering fool whose time had passed. I watched it all. My silence a shield, my patience a weapon. But each slight, each sneer was a stone added to the weight in my chest. I saw the way he looked at Chloe, not with love, but with the cold appraisal of a man assessing an investment. He didn't want her heart. He wanted her future, the inheritance he believed was waiting when I was gone. He treated me like a clause in a contract, something to be managed, tolerated, eventually erased. And Chloe, my Chloe, let him. She didn't defend me, didn't challenge him. Her eyes would meet mine, then dart away as if she couldn't bear the shame of what she was becoming. The timber house, our sanctuary, became a battlefield of unspoken words. I'd sit by the fireplace, the stones I'd gathered with Isabella warm under my touch, and feel her presence in the quiet. The house was more than wood and nail, it was alive with her memory, a place where the veil between worlds seemed thin. On still nights when the lake mirrored the stars, I'd hear whispers, not words, but feelings, her strength urging me to protect what we had built. It was as if she knew even in death that our daughter was slipping away, that our legacy was under siege. I began to notice signs, small, impossible things. A blueprint on my desk would shift slightly its lines, aligning in ways that hinted at a plan I hadn't yet seen. A breeze would carry the scent of her perfume, faint but unmistakable, guiding my thoughts. These weren't delusions of grief. They were messages subtle and profound, reminding me of the power I held not just in wealth but in purpose. I had built Morgan Construction from nothing, not with luck, but with a vision that saw beyond the visible. That vision had always been tied to Isabella, to the love we shared, and now it was tied to protecting Chloe even from herself. I had created the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust not just to shield our wealth, but to test the world's worth. By living simply, I stripped away the glitter that drew vultures like Preston. I wanted to see who would value me for who I was, not what I could give. Preston saw only a bank account, and Chloe, under his spell, was beginning to see the same. One evening, as the lake glowed under a crescent moon, I sat in my study, the room Preston would later dismiss as a Peloton space. My fingers traced the spines of old books, their pages filled with stories of honor and betrayal. But my eyes fell on a silver frame, a photograph of Isabella taken the day we broke ground on the Grand Majestic. She stood in a muddy field, my oversized hard hat tilted on her head, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her smile brighter than the sun. That smile had been my anchor, my reason to keep building when the world tried to break me. Now it was a reminder of what was at stake. I whispered to her, my voice soft in the quiet room. "Izzy, what would you do?" The air stirred a faint breeze, carrying the scent of her lavender perfume. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. She would have been heartbroken by Chloe's drift, but she would have fought for her not with anger, but with the fierce love that defined her. Isabella despised greed, loathed those who valued money over people. She would have seen Preston for what he was, a thief not of wealth, but of trust, of family. The shift in Chloe wasn't just a betrayal, it was a desecration of everything Isabella and I had built. Each request for money, each glance of embarrassment at my truck or my home, was a step away from the values we had instilled in her. I had let it happen, hoping she would see through Preston's facade, but her silence in the ballroom tonight had been the final blow. She had chosen his world over ours, his lies over my truth. But I wasn't done fighting for her, not yet. As I stood in the azure ballroom, the memory of those moments burned in my mind. The guests' eyes were on me, but I saw only Chloe. Her head bowed, her silence, a wall between us. I felt the weight of Isabella's presence, not just in my heart, but in the air, the walls, the flickering lights. The ballroom wasn't just a building, it was a monument to our love, and it seemed to hum with her will, urging me to act. I straightened further, the last traces of frosting wiped away my gaze, locking onto Preston. He was still stammering, his voice a weak thread in the growing storm. "Tell them, Chloe," he pleaded, but she didn't move. I took another step forward, the marble floor resonating under my feet, as if the ballroom itself was aligning with my purpose. "You've mistaken silence for weakness, Preston," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You've mistaken my patience for surrender. But this isn't your stage, it's mine." The crowd stilled their breaths, held sensing the shift in the air. The chandeliers flickered again, their light bending in impossible ways, casting shadows that seemed to dance to my words. Preston's eyes widened, his panic now, a living thing clawing at his composure. He looked to Chloe, to his friends, to anyone who might save him, but the room was no longer his. It was mine, and I was only beginning to show them what that meant. The mystery of my power, the depth of my resolve was unraveling, and with it, the lies that had bound my daughter. I felt Isabella's presence stronger now, her strength. A fire in my veins, her love a shield around my heart. This wasn't just about me. It was about her, about Chloe, about the legacy we had built, and the truth I would defend. The storm was gathering, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the illusions and build something true in their place. The azure ballroom's pulse lingered in the air, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in sync with the storm brewing inside me. The guests' murmurs had quieted their eyes, darting between me, Preston, and Chloe, who sat frozen at the head table, her hands still covering her face. The remnants of the cake's frosting clung to my skin, a sticky reminder of the humiliation I had endured, but my spine was steel, my gaze unyielding. Preston's panic was palpable, his pale face betraying the cracks in his carefully crafted facade. Henry Harrison's words, "He owns half this city," hung like a guillotine, and I felt the weight of the truth behind them. But this moment, this public shaming, was only the surface of a deeper wound, one carved over months by Preston's calculated greed and Chloe's silent betrayal. To understand the fire now kindling in my chest, you had to see the steps that led us here, the wedding plans that weren't plans at all, but a ledger of ambition, and the escalating insults that pushed me to the edge of my patience. It began 3 months before the wedding in a private dining room at the Obsidian Club, a fortress of wealth where the city's elite traded secrets over $500 plates of caviar. Preston had summoned me there, his invitation delivered through Chloe with a formality that felt like a court order. I arrived in my old leather jacket, the one with the rebar scar from the Liberty Tower, and felt the maitre d's eyes linger on me with thinly veiled disdain. The room was a cathedral of excess black marble walls, gold-leafed ceilings, and a chandelier that seemed to hum with the same strange energy as the azure ballroom. Preston sat at the head of a long table, his mother Diana Vanderbilt beside him, her face a mask of Botox and contempt. Chloe was there too, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin, as if it could anchor her to a world she still understood. Leo Preston began, his voice smooth as oil but sharp as a blade. "We're here to discuss the wedding of the century." He gestured to a leather-bound binder, its pages thick with spreadsheets, mood boards, and timelines, a blueprint for extravagance. "Chloe deserves the best, and we're going to give it to her. But we'll need your contribution." The word hung in the air, heavy with expectation, and Diana's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded, and let them talk, knowing every word was a step closer to revealing their true intentions. The plan was obscene in its opulence, a $500,000 budget for a single day, with line items that read like a satire of wealth. $40,000 for imported orchids flown in from Thailand, $30,000 for vintage champagne, because Preston insists on authenticity, Diana purred. A $15,000 custom ice sculpture of Chloe and Preston melting into a pool of edible gold flakes. The venue, they declared, would be the Sapphire Pavilion, a glass-domed monstrosity owned by one of Preston's investors. I suggested the Grand Majestic Hotel, the crown jewel of my empire, a place Isabella and I had poured our hearts into. "It's sentimental," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "It's where I met her mother." Preston laughed, a sharp barking sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Sentimental, Leo, that place is a relic like your truck." No offense, of course. His smile was a lie, his words a deliberate jab. Diana chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "The Grand Majestic is quaint, but it's not up to our standards. Chloe deserves something modern, something that reflects her future." Chloe flinched at the word quaint, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment before dropping back to the tablecloth. She didn't speak, didn't defend the place where her mother's laughter had once echoed. Her silence was a fresh cut deeper than Preston's mockery. The binder was slid across the table, its pages open to a column labeled Morgan Contribution. It wasn't a request, it was a bill. $250,000 neatly itemized, as if I were a vendor to be invoiced. "We've done the math," Preston said, his tone patronizing as if explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "This is your share, assuming you want Chloe to have the day she deserves." Diana leaned forward, her diamond necklace glinting like a warning. "It's an investment in her happiness, Leo. Surely you can manage that even on your limited means." The implication was clear. They thought I was scraping by a retired contractor with a dwindling pension too stubborn to trade my old truck for something respectable. I said nothing, my fingers tracing the scar on my jacket, a reminder of the battles I'd fought and won. I could have paid for the entire wedding with a single phone call, but I let them believe their lie. I wanted to see how far they would push, how deep their greed ran. "I'll see what I can do," I said, my voice calm, almost deferential. Preston's smirk widened, mistaking my restraint for weakness. Chloe looked up, her eyes pleading for something, understanding, forgiveness. I couldn't tell, but she said nothing. That silence, once a bond between us, was now a chasm. The next blow came a week later in the form of a manila envelope delivered to my timber house by a courier who looked uncomfortable stepping onto my porch. Inside was a prenuptial agreement drafted by Preston's lawyer, its language cold and precise. It stipulated that upon my death, Preston would be entitled to 50% of Chloe's inheritance, including any assets tied to Morgan Construction or its holdings. The document was a map of his intentions, a blueprint of betrayal. He wasn't just marrying Chloe. He was betting on my demise, calculating the years I had left, as if my life were a stock he could short. I sat in my study, the envelope open on my desk, the faint scent of lavender drifting through the room. Isabella's presence was strong that night, the air warm with her memory, the lake outside shimmering with an unnatural light. I traced the lines of the prenup, my fingers lingering on the clauses that spoke of anticipated assets and future disbursements. It was a vulture's document, written by a man who saw my daughter as a vault to be cracked. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I swore I heard her voice, not words, but a feeling, a surge of strength that said, "Don't let him win." The blueprint on my desk shifted slightly, its corners curling as if touched by an unseen hand, and I knew she was with me, guiding me through the storm. I called Chloe the next day, my voice steady but heavy with hope. "Sweetheart, do you know what this prenup means?" I asked, holding the document as if it were a bomb. Her response was halting, defensive. "Preston says it's standard, Dad. It's to protect us both. Us." The word stung because it wasn't about her. It was about him, his family, their debts. I pressed further, gently, trying to reach the girl who once trusted me. "Chloe, this isn't protection. It's a plan to take what's ours, what your mother and I built." She hesitated, then snapped, "You don't understand, Dad. You never do. Preston's building a future for us, something bigger than your old house and your old truck." The line went dead, and with it, a piece of my heart. The insults escalated as the wedding drew closer. Preston began to treat me not just as an inconvenience, but as an obstacle to be removed. At a planning meeting in a downtown loft, he presented a revised budget, now $600,000 with my contribution, raised to $350,000. "Inflation," he said with a shrug, his eyes gleaming with something darker than greed, triumph, as if he were already counting the spoils. Diana handed me a brochure for Golden Meadows, a luxury retirement community, her voice syrupy with false concern. "We've been thinking about your future, Leo. This place would be so much more comfortable for you. You wouldn't have to burden Chloe anymore." The word burden was a knife, and Chloe's silence, as she sat beside them, was its twist. I took the brochure, my fingers steady despite the rage simmering beneath my calm. The cover showed smiling seniors playing chess, but I saw the truth. They wanted me out of the way, locked in a gilded cage while they plundered my legacy. I looked at Chloe, searching for a flicker of the girl who once saw stars in the lake. But her eyes were fixed on Preston, her hand resting on his arm. She was slipping away not just from me, but from herself, from the values Isabella and I had woven into her soul. The final insult came during a visit to the timber house, a rare moment when Chloe came alone. She stood in the living room, her designer coat out of place against the worn wooden walls, and suggested updating the house. Preston thinks we could make it modern, Dad. You know, open-plan smart home tech. It'd be worth so much more. Her words were a desecration, a plan to erase Isabella's memory from the very walls that held her. I felt the air shift, the scent of lavender stronger now, the windows rattling faintly as if the house itself protested. "This house is enough," I said, my voice low but firm. "It's not about worth, it's about love." She looked away, her cheeks flushing, and I saw the shame in her eyes, but it wasn't enough to stop her. That night, as I sat by the lake, the water glowing with a light that seemed to pulse with Isabella's presence, I made a decision. I had tested them long enough, watched their greed grow like a weed choking a garden. Preston thought he could rewrite my story, turn me into a footnote in his conquest. Chloe, my daughter, had chosen his lies over my truth, at least for now. But I was no footnote. I was Leo Morgan, architect of empires, keeper of secrets, and guardian of a legacy that burned brighter than their shallow ambitions. In the azure ballroom, as I faced Preston's crumbling bravado, I felt that legacy stir within me. The chandeliers flickered again, their light bending in ways that defied physics, as if the room itself was aligning with my will. The guests sensed it too, their whispers falling silent, their eyes wide with anticipation. Preston's voice broke the stillness, a desperate plea to Chloe. "Tell them he's lying, babe. Tell them he's nobody." But she didn't speak, her hands still covering her face, her silence a weight I could no longer carry alone. I stepped closer, the marble floor resonating under my feet, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the promise of a storm. "You've misjudged me, Preston," I said, my voice a low rumble carrying the weight of decades. "You've misjudged this place, this moment, and the woman whose memory lives in every stone. You think you can take what's mine, but you're about to learn how wrong you are." The crowd leaned in, the ballroom's pulse growing stronger, as if it were alive, waiting for my next move. Isabella's presence was a fire in my veins, her love a shield around my heart. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a reckoning, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the lies and build something true in their place. The azure ballroom's pulse thrummed in my veins, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the city I had built. The guests' eyes were fixed on me, their whispers silenced by the weight of Henry Harrison's revelation and the fire in my voice. Preston stood frozen, his face a mask of panic, the word beggar he had spat at me, now a noose tightening around his neck. Chloe remained at the head table, her hands still shielding her face, her silence a wound that bled deeper with each passing second. The frosting on my skin had hardened into a brittle crust, but beneath it my resolve was molten, a furnace of purpose stoked by decades of love and loss. The humiliation in this glittering hall was not the end. It was the spark. To understand the depth of Preston's betrayal, the audacity of his greed, you had to see the moment he tried to take the one thing I held sacred, the timber house by the lake, the sanctuary I built for Isabella, the heart of our legacy. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, 6 weeks before the wedding, when the plan was revealed. The lake outside my home shimmered with a light that seemed too bright for the season, as if the water itself held secrets it refused to share. I was in my study, surrounded by blueprints and books, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and the faint trace of Isabella's lavender perfume. The house was more than a structure. It was a living memory, each beam carved with the promises we made, each window framing a moment of our life together. I was sketching a new design, a small community center for the town, when I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Not the familiar rumble of a neighbor's truck, but the sleek purr of a luxury car, alien in this quiet place. Chloe stepped out first, her designer boots sinking into the soft earth, her face a mix of determination and unease. Preston followed his tailored coat absurd against the wild beauty of the lake, his eyes scanning the house with the cold appraisal of a vulture circling carry on. I opened the door before they could knock, my instincts already on edge. "Dad," Chloe said, her voice strained, "we need to talk." Her words carried a weight I hadn't heard before, a script she was reciting but didn't fully believe. Preston's smile was all teeth, a predator's grin that made the air feel heavier, as if the house itself sensed an intruder. They stepped inside Preston's polished shoes, clicking on the floorboards I'd laid with my own hands. He didn't wipe his feet this time, a deliberate disrespect, as if marking the space as his own. Chloe hesitated at the threshold, her eyes flickering to the fireplace where Isabella's photograph sat, its silver frame catching the afternoon light. For a moment I thought I saw a spark of the girl who once ran through these rooms laughing as she chased fireflies. But then Preston's hand found her shoulder and the spark faded, replaced by a mask of compliance. "Nice place, Pops," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension as he surveyed the room. "Rustic charm, I suppose, but it's a bit dated, don't you think?" He ran a finger along the mantel as if checking for dust, his smirk a challenge. I said nothing, my hands clasped behind my back, my silence a shield I had honed over years. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. "Preston has some ideas, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the house, for after the wedding." The words hit like a blow, not because of their content, but because of what they implied. The house wasn't just a building. It was Isabella. It was us. It was the sanctuary where I felt her presence most strongly. Every night when the lake glowed with an unnatural light, I'd sit on the porch and feel her warmth in the breeze, her laughter in the rustle of leaves. The house was alive with her, a conduit to something beyond this world, a mystery I didn't fully understand but fiercely protected. And now they wanted to claim it. Preston pulled a tablet from his bag, its screen glowing with architectural renderings, sleek, sterile designs that bore no trace of the house's soul. "We've been thinking," he said, his tone that of a salesman closing a deal. "This place could be so much more. Open plan, smart home tech, maybe a glass extension to maximize the lake view. It's got potential, Leo, but it needs investment. Modernization." He swiped through images of a house I didn't recognize. Marble counters, floor-to-ceiling windows. A minimalist shell that would erase every trace of Isabella. "It'd be worth millions," he added, his eyes gleaming with greed. "A real asset for Chloe's future." I looked at Chloe, searching for a sign that she saw the sacrilege in his words. Her eyes met mine, then darted away, her cheeks flushing with shame. "It's just an idea, Dad," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. She was parroting his script, her loyalty divided, her heart caught in his web. I felt the air shift, the scent of lavender growing stronger, the windows rattling faintly as if the house itself was protesting. "This house isn't an asset," I said, my voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of a lifetime. "It's a promise. It's your mother." Preston laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the walls. "Sentimental nonsense, Pops. This is about building a future, not clinging to the past." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if we were partners in his scheme. "Chloe and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense for us to move in here after the wedding. You know, to save money while we establish ourselves. You could use the space, and we'd take good care of it." His smile was a lie, his words a velvet glove over a fist. I saw the truth in his eyes. He wanted the house not for love, but for profit, for control. The audacity of it stole my breath. This wasn't just about money, it was about erasure, about tearing down the sanctuary Isabella and I had built, about rewriting our story to fit his narrative. I felt the house respond, the air growing heavier, the light from the lake casting strange shadows across the room. The photograph on the mantel seemed to glow, Isabella's eyes watching, judging. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms, and forced myself to stay calm. And where would I go? I asked, my voice steady, despite the fire in my chest. Preston's smile widened as if he'd been waiting for the question. "We've got that covered, Leo." He pulled a brochure from his bag, the same one Diana had shown me at the Obsidian Club for Golden Meadows, the luxury retirement community. "This place is perfect for you. Private suites, gourmet dining, even a lake view. You'd be comfortable, taken care of. No more burdens." The word burdens was a deliberate jab, a reminder of his mother's words, a suggestion that I was an obstacle to be removed. Chloe flinched, her eyes darting to the brochure, then to me, but she said nothing. Her silence was a betrayal deeper than any word. I took the brochure, my fingers brushing the glossy paper, and felt a surge of Isabella's presence, sharp and fierce, like a gust of wind through an open window. The room seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening, as if the house itself was rising in defiance. "This house is my home," I said, my voice a low rumble, carrying the weight of decades. "It's where I promised your mother I'd protect you, Chloe. It's not for sale, not for modernization, not for anyone." I looked at her, willing her to see the truth, to remember the girl who saw stars in the lake. But her eyes were fixed on Preston, her hand still on his arm, her silence a wall between us. Preston shrugged, undeterred, his confidence unshaken. "Think about it, Pops. It's what's best for everyone. Chloe deserves a home that matches her future, not some relic of the past." He turned to her, his voice softening, manipulative. "Right, babe." She nodded, a small, hesitant motion, her eyes avoiding mine. It was the final straw, the moment I realized how far she had drifted, how deeply his poison had seeped into her soul. The house trembled, a faint vibration under my feet, as if Isabella herself was crying out against the desecration. That night, alone in my study, I sat with the brochure, its pages mocking me with images of smiling seniors and sterile luxury. The lake outside glowed with an unnatural light, its surface rippling as if stirred by an unseen hand. I felt Isabella's presence stronger than ever, the scent of lavender thick in the air, the photograph on the mantel seeming to pulse with her energy. I whispered to her, my voice breaking. "Izzy, they want to take it all, our home, our daughter, our legacy." The air stirred, a breeze carrying her warmth, her strength. The blueprint on my desk shifted its lines, aligning in a pattern I hadn't drawn, a message I couldn't yet read, but felt in my bones. I knew then that my patience was nearing its end. Preston wasn't just after my wealth, he was after my soul, the heart of everything I had built with Isabella. He thought he could erase me, lock me away in a gilded cage, while he stripped the house of its meaning. Chloe's complicity was a wound that bled, but it wasn't fatal, not yet. I still believed I could reach her, pull her back from the edge, remind her of the love that had shaped her. But to do that, I had to act, to wield the power I had buried for so long. In the Azure Ballroom, as I faced Preston's crumbling bravado, the memory of that afternoon burned in my mind. The guests watched, their silence heavy with anticipation, the chandeliers flickering as if the room itself was alive with Isabella's will. Preston's voice broke the stillness, a desperate plea to Chloe. "Tell them it's not true, babe. Tell them he's nothing." But she didn't speak, her hands still shielding her face, her silence a weight that pressed against my heart. I stepped forward, and the marble floor resonating under my feet, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the promise of a reckoning. "You thought you could take my home, Preston," I said, my voice a low thunder carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You thought you could take my daughter, my legacy, and bury me in a brochure. But you've awakened something you can't control." The crowd leaned in, the ballroom's pulse growing stronger, the shadows dancing to my words. Preston's eyes widened, his panic now a wildfire consuming his composure. He looked to Chloe, to his allies, but found no salvation. The room was mine, its energy aligning with my purpose, its walls humming with the strength of the woman who had shaped me. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a battlefield, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the lies and build something true in their place. The azure ballroom's pulse lingered in my memory, a faint echo of the storm that had ignited within me. The guests' eyes, the flickering chandeliers, and Chloe's silence still burned in my mind. But the moment in the ballroom was only a prelude to the deeper wound inflicted at the rehearsal dinner. Standing there with the remnants of frosting hardening on my skin, I faced Preston's crumbling bravado and felt the weight of a lifetime converging on this moment. His panicked plea, "Tell them he's nothing," babe, hung in the air, unanswered by Chloe's bowed head and trembling hands. The crowd watched breathless, sensing the shift in the room, the air thick with the scent of lavender and the promise of a reckoning. But to understand why this moment was the spark that set my resolve ablaze, you had to see the night before the wedding, when Preston's cruelty reached its peak, when his plan to erase me was laid bare, and when my patience finally broke. It was the evening of the rehearsal dinner held at Aperture, a sleek restaurant perched on the city's skyline, its glass walls offering a view of the empire I had built. The place was a monument to modern excess, all polished chrome and minimalist lines, its air heavy with the scent of truffle oil and ambition. I arrived in my old leather jacket, the one scarred from the Liberty Tower, and felt the weight of eyes upon me, waiters, guests, Preston's allies, all judging the man they thought was out of place. But I wasn't out of place. I was Leo Morgan, architect of this city, and every skyscraper visible through those windows bore my mark, a silent testament to the power they couldn't see. The dining room was filled with Preston's chosen elite business associates, socialites, and his mother Diana, whose diamond earrings glinted like warning signals. Chloe sat at the head table, her rehearsal gown a soft cream that made her look like a ghost of the girl I raised. Her eyes flickered to me as I entered, a fleeting spark of recognition, but it vanished as Preston's hand found hers, his grip possessive, his smile a mask of control. I took my seat at a table near the back, relegated to the margins by design, my presence an obligation rather than an honor. The air hummed with a strange energy, not unlike the pulse of the azure ballroom, as if the city itself was watching, waiting. The dinner began with toasts, each one a performance of flattery and false sentiment. Preston's best man, a slick financier named Jared, raised his glass to the couple's unstoppable future, his words dripping with innuendo about wealth and status. Diana followed, her voice syrupy, as she praised Chloe's transformation into a woman worthy of her son. Each toast was a jab, a reminder that I was an outsider in this world. They were crafting a world that had no place for an old man in a flannel shirt. I sipped my water, my silence a shield, my eyes scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Then Preston stood, his glass, raised, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. To Chloe he began, his voice smooth but laced with malice. "The woman who's shown me what it means to dream big." And to her father, Leo, who, well, let's just say he's taught us the value of humility. The room laughed, a brittle, complicit chuckle that grated against my skin. He wasn't done. "I've got a story for you," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, a predator savoring his prey. "A few months ago, I had a flat tire on my way to a meeting. Guess who came to the rescue? Good old Pops, with his rusty toolbox and his unique skills." The crowd leaned in their laughter, already bubbling, eager for the punchline. Preston's voice grew louder, his gestures theatrical. There he was, fumbling with a jack like he'd never seen one before, grease all over his hands, muttering about back in his day. Took him an hour to get that tire off, and by then I'd missed my meeting. But you know what, I let him finish because that's what you do for family, right? The room erupted, laughter, crashing over me like a wave, each guffaw a nail in the coffin of my dignity. The story was a lie, a fabrication woven from whole cloth, but it didn't matter. It was a weapon designed to paint me as a bumbling fool, a relic unfit for their glittering world. I felt the air shift, the restaurant's glass walls seeming to shimmer, as if the city itself was recoiling from the lie. The scent of lavender drifted through the room, faint but unmistakable, a reminder of Isabella's presence, her strength. I looked at Chloe, willing her to speak, to call out the falsehood, but she sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the table, her hands trembling. Her silence was a blade cutting deeper than Preston's words, deeper than the laughter. It was the silence of a daughter who had chosen his world over mine, who had let him rewrite her father's story. Preston wasn't finished. He raised his glass higher, his voice taking on a mock-serious tone. "But seriously, Leo, we've been thinking about you, about your future. Chloe and I want you to know you're taken care of." He paused for effect, letting the anticipation build, then gestured to Jared, who produced a sleek folder embossed with the Golden Meadows logo. "We've secured a spot for you at Golden Meadows, the finest retirement community in the state. Private suite lake view, all the comforts you deserve. It's our gift to you, Pops, so you can rest easy knowing you're not a burden anymore." The room burst into applause, a wave of approval that felt like a physical blow. The word burden was a deliberate echo of Diana's cruelty, a public declaration that I was no longer needed, no longer wanted. The folder was passed to me, its weight heavy in my hands, its pages a blueprint for my erasure. I opened it, my fingers steady despite the rage burning in my chest, and saw the details: a premium package, move-in date, 1 month after the wedding, a contract already signed in Preston's name. It wasn't a gift, it was a banishment, a plan to lock me away while they claimed my home, my legacy, my daughter. The air grew heavier, the restaurant's lights flickering, casting strange shadows that danced across the glass walls. The scent of lavender intensified, a warm presence that seemed to wrap around me, shielding me from the laughter. I felt Isabella's strength, her indignation, as if she were standing beside me, her hand on my shoulder. The city outside the windows seemed to pulse, its skyline, a testament to the empire we had built together, now threatened by a man who saw it as a prize to be stolen. I looked at Chloe, searching for a flicker of resistance, but she was still, her eyes glistening with tears. She wouldn't shed her silence a final betrayal. In that moment, something broke inside me. Not my heart, but the chains of my patience. I had tested them, watched their greed grow, hoped Chloe would see through Preston's lies. But this public crucifixion, this plan to exile me from my own life, was the end of my restraint. I stood, the folder still in my hands, and the room fell silent, the laughter dying as if choked by an unseen force. The guests sensed the shift, their eyes wide with unease, the air thick with anticipation. Even Preston faltered, his smirk flickering as if he could feel the storm gathering. "You've gone too far, Preston," I said, my voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of decades. "You think you can erase me, lock me away in a brochure, take my home, my daughter, my legacy. But you don't know who I am." The words were a thunderclap echoing off the glass walls, the lights flickering again as if the restaurant itself was responding. The scent of lavender was overwhelming, now a fire in the air, and I felt Isabella's presence, stronger than ever, her strength flowing through me, a river of resolve that would not be damned. Preston laughed, a nervous, brittle sound, but it lacked conviction. "Come on, Pops, it's a joke. Lighten up." But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the crowd, seeking allies who were no longer certain. Chloe looked up, her face pale. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. I held her gaze, willing her to see me, to remember the man who built her world, but she looked away, her silence a wall I could no longer breach. I set the folder on the table, its pages open to the contract, and stepped forward, my shoes clicking on the polished floor. The room seemed to tilt, the skyline outside shimmering with an unnatural light, as if the city itself was aligning with my purpose. "This isn't a gift," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's a declaration of war. You think you can bury me, Preston, but you've only awakened me. This city, this moment, this fight, it's mine." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that shifted the air. Preston's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he tried to salvage his control. "You're delusional, old man," he stammered, but his voice was weak, a thread unraveling. The guests leaned in, their eyes wide with fascination, sensing that they were witnessing something larger than a family dispute, A reckoning, a clash of forces they couldn't fully comprehend. I turned to leave the folder abandoned on the table, its pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breeze. The restaurant's lights flickered again, the shadows dancing in patterns that seemed to spell out a warning. I felt Isabella's presence not just in my heart, but in the air, the walls, the city itself. She was with me, her love, a shield, her strength, a sword. This was no longer about patience. It was about power, about protecting what we had built, about saving Chloe from the man who would destroy her. Back in the Azure Ballroom, as I faced Preston's crumbling facade, the memory of that night fueled my resolve. The guests watched, their silence heavy, the chandeliers pulsing with a light that seemed to bend to my will. Preston's plea to Chloe, "Tell them he's nothing," was a desperate gasp, but her silence was the final nail. I stepped closer, the marble floor resonating under my feet, the air thick with lavender and the promise of justice. "You thought you could break me, Preston?" I said, my voice a low thunder carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You thought you could take my home, my daughter, my legacy, and cast me aside like a relic. But you've awakened something you can't control, a power you'll never understand." The crowd leaned in, the ballroom's pulse growing stronger, the shadows dancing to my words. Isabella's presence was a fire in my veins, her love a beacon guiding me forward. This was no longer a wedding, it was a battlefield, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the lies and build something true in their place. The storm was here, and I was its master. The Azure Ballroom thrummed with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, its walls alive with the weight of the moment. The guests' eyes were locked on me, their whispers silenced by the fire in my words and the shadow of Henry Harrison's revelation. Preston stood before me, his face a mask of desperation, his plea to Chloe, "Tell them he's nothing," hanging unanswered in the air. Chloe remained at the head table, her hands shielding her face, her silence a wound that cut deeper than the laughter that had followed my humiliation. The frosting on my skin had hardened into a brittle shell, but beneath it my resolve was a furnace, stoked by the betrayal of the rehearsal dinner and the audacity of Preston's plan to seize my home. This moment was not the end. It was the beginning of my counterattack, a plan I had crafted in the shadows, a reckoning I called the Sunset Protocol. The night of the rehearsal dinner had shattered my patience, but it had also ignited something deeper, a power I had buried since Isabella's death, a strength woven from love loss and the secrets we had guarded together. I left Aperture with the Golden Meadows folder in my hand, its pages a testament to Preston's arrogance, a blueprint for my banishment. The city skyline shimmered outside the restaurant's glass walls, its lights flickering as if in acknowledgement of the storm I was about to unleash. I drove back to the timber house by the lake, the old truck's engine a steady hum that grounded me, its scratched dashboard, a reminder of Isabella's touch. The lake glowed with an unnatural light, its surface rippling as if stirred by her presence, and I felt her with me, her strength. A whisper in the wind. In my study, surrounded by blueprints and the scent of cedar, I sat at my desk, the Golden Meadows folder open before me. The air was thick with lavender, a sign that Isabella was near her energy, a warm embrace that steadied my trembling hands. I traced the lines of the contract, its clauses a map of Preston's, greed, his plan to lock me away while he claimed my home, my daughter, my legacy. But he had underestimated me, mistaken my silence for surrender. I was no broken old man. I was Leo Morgan, architect of empires, keeper of secrets, and guardian of a love that transcended death. I reached for the phone, my fingers steady despite the fire in my chest, and dialed Evelyn Reed, my lawyer and confidant of 30 years. Her voice answered on the first ring, sharp and unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Leo," she said, her tone a mix of concern and readiness. "What's happened?" I told her everything. The cake, the laughter, the rehearsal dinner, the Golden Meadows contract, the plan to seize the house. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, each word a stone in the foundation of my resolve. It's time, Evelyn, I said. Activate the Sunset Protocol. The Sunset Protocol was no ordinary plan. It was a fortress of strategy designed in the months after Isabella's death, when I realized the world would always come for what we had built. It was born in the quiet of the timber house where the lake's glow and Isabella's presence had guided my hand as I drafted its framework. The protocol was a series of legal and financial maneuvers, a labyrinth of trusts clauses and contingencies that protected my legacy from vultures like Preston. At its core was the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust, a vault that held the bulk of my wealth, billions in assets from skyscrapers to land all shielded from prying hands. I had lived on a modest stipend, not out of necessity but to test the world to see who would value me for my heart, not my fortune. The trust was more than a legal construct. It was a promise to Isabella, a vow to protect Chloe, and the values we had instilled in her. By living simply, I had stripped away the glitter that drew predators, revealing their true colors. Preston had failed that test spectacularly, his greed a beacon that lit up every flaw in his soul. The Sunset Protocol was my response, a mechanism to dismantle those who sought to exploit us. It included provisions to transfer my assets into untouchable trusts, rendering them inaccessible to anyone but designated beneficiaries, Chloe, but only if she proved worthy of our legacy. It also empowered Evelyn to act as my proxy, wielding the legal might of Morgan Construction, to crush those who crossed me. I explained the situation to Evelyn, my voice steady but laced with the urgency of a man who had reached his limit. Preston thinks he can erase me, I said, but he's about to learn who I am. I need you at the wedding, Evelyn. Bring the documents, the proof, everything. And call Henry Harrison, he needs to be there too. Henry, my old friend and fellow Titan, had built his own empire alongside mine. His loyalty was unshakable, his presence a weapon in itself. Evelyn didn't hesitate. It's done, Leo. Tomorrow we end this. Her words were a spark igniting the plan that had lain dormant for too long. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, the room alive with Isabella's presence. The lake outside glowed brighter, its light casting patterns on the walls, patterns that seemed to mirror the blueprints on my desk. I picked one up, an old design for the Azure Ballroom, and noticed something strange. The lines had shifted, forming a symbol I hadn't drawn, a spiral that pulsed with the same energy as the lake. It was no coincidence. Isabella was with me, her spirit woven into the fabric of this fight, guiding me as she always had. I whispered to her, my voice soft in the quiet room. Izzy, I'm doing this for you, for Chloe, for us. The air stirred, a breeze carrying her lavender scent, and I felt her strength, her love, a fire that burned away any doubt. The Sunset Protocol wasn't just about protecting assets. It was about teaching a lesson, about showing the world that true power lies not in wealth, but in integrity. Preston had seen my simplicity as weakness, my silence as surrender. But he was wrong. Every dollar I sent Chloe, every insult I endured had been a test, a way to measure the depth of their betrayal. The Golden Meadows contract was the final straw, a declaration of war that demanded a response. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for Isabella's memory, for Chloe's soul, for the legacy we had built with love and sacrifice. I spent the night preparing, not with weapons or fists, but with the tools of my trade knowledge strategy and the quiet power of a man who had built a city from nothing. I reviewed the trust documents, their clauses, a map of my counterattack. I called Henry, his voice a rumble of loyalty over the phone. Leo, I've got your back, he said. Preston's about to learn what it means to cross a Morgan. His words were a reminder of the battles we had fought together, the skyscrapers we had raised, the enemies we had buried. He would be at the wedding, his presence a signal that the tide was turning. As dawn broke, the lake glowed with a light that seemed to pulse with purpose, its surface rippling as if Isabella herself was stirring the waters. I stood on the porch, the timber house humming behind me, its walls alive with her memory. I felt her hand in mine, not in flesh but in spirit, a warmth that steadied my resolve. The Sunset Protocol was more than a plan. It was a vow, a promise to protect what we had built to save Chloe from the man who would destroy her. I drove to the Azure Ballroom, the old truck's engine a steady heartbeat, the city skyline shimmering with an energy that seemed to acknowledge my purpose. In the ballroom, as I faced Preston's panic and Chloe's silence, the memory of that night fueled my resolve. The guests watched their breaths, held the chandeliers flickering, as if the room itself was aligning with my will. The scent of lavender was overwhelming, a reminder that Isabella was with me, her strength a fire in my veins. I stepped forward, the marble floor resonating under my feet, the air thick with anticipation. "You thought you could erase me, Preston," I said, my voice a low thunder, carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You thought you could take my home, my daughter, my legacy, and lock me away in a gilded cage. But you've awakened a power you can't comprehend." The crowd leaned in, the ballroom's pulse growing stronger, the shadows dancing to my words. Preston's eyes widened, his panic a wildfire consuming his composure. He looked to Chloe, to his allies, but found no salvation. I felt the weight of the Sunset Protocol, its clauses a sword in my hand, its purpose a shield around my heart. Evelyn was on her way, her briefcase filled with the documents that would unravel Preston's schemes. Henry stood at the edge of the room, his presence a bulwark, a reminder that I was not alone. The city itself seemed to hum, its skyline pulsing with the same energy as the lake, as if Isabella's spirit was woven into every stone, every beam, every moment. This was no longer a wedding. It was a battlefield, and I was its architect, ready to tear down the lies and build something true in their place. The Sunset Protocol was active, and with it, I would show Preston the cost of his greed, Chloe, the weight of her choices, and the world the power of a man who refused to be broken. The Azure Ballroom pulsed with a life of its own, its walls humming with an energy that seemed to echo the fire in my veins. The guests' eyes were locked on me, their whispers silenced by the weight of my words and the shock of Henry Harrison's revelation. "He owns half this city." Preston Vanderbilt stood before me, his face drained of color, his once smug grin replaced by a mask of panic. His desperate plea to Chloe, "Tell them he's nothing," hung unanswered, her hands still shielding her face, her silence a wound that cut deeper than the laughter that had followed my humiliation. The frosting on my skin had hardened into a brittle shell, but beneath it my resolve was a furnace, stoked by months of betrayal, by Preston's audacious plan to seize my home, and by the rehearsal dinner's final insult. This was no longer a wedding, it was a battlefield, and I was its architect, ready to unleash the Sunset Protocol and tear down the lies that had bound my daughter. The air in the ballroom grew heavier, the chandeliers flickering with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. The scent of lavender was overwhelming, a warm presence that wrapped around me, a reminder that Isabella was with me, her strength guiding my hand. I stood tall, my old leather jacket, a badge of battles won, my gaze locked on Preston as he stammered, searching for a lifeline in a room that was no longer his. The guests leaned in, their breaths held, sensing that they were witnessing something larger than a family dispute, a reckoning, a clash of forces that transcended the mortal plane. The city skyline, visible through the ballroom's windows, shimmered with an unnatural light, as if it too was aligning with my purpose. I took a step forward, the marble floor resonating under my feet, each click of my shoes a declaration of intent. "You thought you could break me, Preston," I said, my voice a low thunder carrying the weight of a lifetime. "You thought you could take my home, my daughter, my legacy, and cast me aside like a relic, but you've awakened something you can't control. A power you'll never understand." The words echoed off the walls, the chandeliers flaring briefly, casting shadows that danced in patterns that seemed to spell out a warning. Preston's eyes widened, his panic a wildfire consuming his composure. He looked to Chloe, to his allies, but found no salvation. The room was mine, and the Sunset Protocol was about to unfold. Before I could speak again, a new presence entered the ballroom. a figure whose arrival shifted the air itself. Evelyn Reed, my lawyer and confidant, strode through the double doors, her briefcase in hand, her eyes sharp as steel. She was a woman forged in the fires of boardrooms and courtrooms, her presence as commanding as Henry's, but with a precision that cut like a scalpel. The guests parted for her, their murmurs rising into a hum that matched the ballroom's pulse. She wore a tailored suit, her silver hair pulled back, and her expression was one of unyielding resolve. In her hands was the key to Preston's undoing the documents that would unravel his schemes. "Leo," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a beacon. "I believe it's time." She set her briefcase on a nearby table, its click echoing in the silence, and opened it to reveal a stack of papers, their edges crisp and ominous. The crowd leaned closer, their curiosity tinged with unease, as if they sensed the weight of what was coming. Preston's face paled further, his hands trembling as he tried to regain control. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice high and brittle. "Some kind of stunt." "You can't scare me with a lawyer, old man." Evelyn's smile was cold, a predator's grin that made Preston flinch. "Oh, I'm not here to scare you, Mr. Vanderbilt," she said, her tone laced with disdain. "I'm here to bury you." She pulled out the first document, a financial report, and held it up for the room to see. "Let's start with the truth about your family's empire, or lack thereof. The Vanderbilt Trust is insolvent, drowning in $27 million of debt. Your real estate ventures are crumbling. Your loans have been denied by every major bank, and your so-called investors are pulling out faster than rats from a sinking ship." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that shifted the air. Preston's mother Diana stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her face a mask of fury. "That's a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "We are the Vanderbilts. Our name is worth more than this. This nobody's." But Evelyn was unmoved, her eyes locked on Preston as she continued. "Your name is a house of cards, Mrs. Vanderbilt, and Leo Morgan, the man you called a beggar, has been bankrolling your charade." She produced another document, a ledger of transactions, and held it aloft. "This wedding, the $600,000 extravagance you demanded, was paid for entirely by Leo Morgan. Every orchid, every bottle of champagne, every gilded detail. You thought you were draining his savings, but you were wrong. Leo is the sole benefactor of the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust, a fund worth billions untouchable by your greed." The crowd murmured, their eyes darting to me, then to Preston, who was now visibly shaking, his composure shattered like glass. Evelyn wasn't finished. She pulled out the prenuptial agreement, the one Preston had sent to secure half of Chloe's inheritance, and held it up like a guillotine. "This document," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "is null and void. It was drafted under false pretenses, with fraudulent claims about your financial stability. You misrepresented your assets, Mr. Vanderbilt, and attempted to manipulate Chloe into signing away her future. But you didn't know who you were dealing with." She turned to me, her eyes softening for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the trust we had built over decades. I stepped forward, my voice steady, my words carrying the weight of the Sunset Protocol. "You thought I was a broke old man, Preston," I said, my gaze locking onto his. "You thought you could push me aside, take my home, my daughter, my legacy. But I've been watching you, testing you, and you failed every measure of worth." The chandeliers flared again, their light bending in impossible ways, casting shadows that seemed to form spirals, echoing the pattern I had seen on my blueprint. The scent of lavender was a fire in the air, Isabella's presence, a force that seemed to hold the room in its grip. Preston's panic erupted into a desperate outburst. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking as he turned to the crowd. "He's lying. They're all lying, Chloe, tell them." But Chloe didn't move, her hands still covering her face, her body trembling with sobs she couldn't release. Her silence was a weight, a final confirmation of the chasm between us. I felt Isabella's presence stronger now, her strength, a river flowing through me, urging me to finish what I had started. Evelyn produced the final document, a deed that sent a ripple of shock through the room. "This is the title to the timber house by the lake," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "It, along with all of Leo's personal assets, was transferred to the Isabella Morgan Legacy Trust years ago. It's untouchable, Mr. Vanderbilt, protected by law and by a man who knows the true meaning of value." She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them like a judge delivering a verdict. "And as of this moment, Leo has directed that the remaining budget for this wedding, every cent he paid, be donated to the Isabella Morgan Foundation, a charity for community development. The staff, however, will receive double their wages, a gesture of gratitude from a man you called a beggar." The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and scattered applause. Diana Vanderbilt swayed her hand, clutching her chest, and collapsed into her chair, her face ashen. Preston staggered back, his eyes wild, his voice reduced to a whimper. "You can't do this," he stammered, but his words were lost in the storm. The guests were on their feet, some shocked, some whispering in awe, others looking at me with a newfound respect. The ballroom's pulse grew stronger, its walls seeming to hum with approval, the chandeliers casting a light that felt alive, as if Isabella herself was bearing witness. I turned to Chloe, my heart heavy but resolute. She looked up at last, her eyes red with tears, her face a canvas of guilt and confusion. "Chloe," I said, my voice soft but unyielding, "you have a choice to make. You can stay with him, with his lies, his greed, and lose everything your mother and I built for you. Or you can come back to the truth, to the love that shaped you, to the legacy that's yours if you choose it." The words were a lifeline, but also a challenge, a test of the daughter I still believed in, buried beneath the spell Preston had cast. She didn't speak, but her eyes held mine for a moment, a flicker of the girl who saw stars in the lake. Then she looked away, her hands trembling, and I knew she wasn't ready, not yet. The pain was sharp, but I didn't falter. I had given her the truth, and now it was hers to carry. I turned to Preston, my gaze cold as steel. "You thought you could rewrite my story," I said, my voice carrying the weight of the city I had built. "But this is my stage, my legacy, and you're nothing but a footnote." I walked toward the doors, my steps deliberate, the marble floor resonating with each one. Henry followed his presence, a silent vow of loyalty, and Evelyn joined us, her briefcase, a symbol of the justice we had delivered. The guests parted their eyes wide with awe and fear, as if they saw me for the first time not as a beggar, but as a titan, a man who had built an empire and refused to let it fall. The ballroom's lights flared one final time, casting spirals of shadow across the walls, a final testament to Isabella's presence, her love, a fire that burned through the lies. As I reached the doors, I paused, looking back at Chloe one last time. "I'll be waiting, sweetheart," I said, my voice soft but resolute, "when you're ready to come home." Then I stepped into the night, the city skyline glowing with a light that seemed to pulse with Isabella's spirit. The Sunset Protocol had done its work, dismantling Preston's schemes, exposing his greed, and reclaiming my dignity. But the fight for Chloe's heart was not over, and I would wait, as I always had, for the daughter I loved to find her way back. The azure ballroom faded into the night as I stepped into the cool air, the city skyline shimmering with a light that seemed to pulse with Isabella's spirit. The weight of the Sunset Protocol's execution lingered in my chest, a quiet triumph, tempered by the ache of Chloe's silence. Henry Harrison walked beside me, his broad frame a steady presence, his loyalty a reminder that I was not alone. Evelyn Reed followed, her briefcase clutched tightly, the documents within a testament to the justice we had delivered. The guests' gasps and Preston Vanderbilt's shattered bravado echoed in my mind, but they were distant now, like the fading notes of a song. The battle was won, but the war for my daughter's heart was far from over. As I drove back to the timber house by the lake, the old truck's engine humming beneath me, I felt the city's pulse align with my own, a rhythm of resolve, of love, of a legacy unbroken. The lake glowed with an unnatural light. As I pulled into the driveway, its surface rippling, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The timber house stood before me, its weathered beams a sanctuary, each one carved with the promises Isabella and I had made. I stepped onto the porch, the air thick with the scent of cedar and lavender, her presence as tangible as the wood beneath my feet. The house was more than a home, it was a conduit, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where Isabella's spirit lingered, guiding me through the storm. I sat in the rocking chair, the one we had bought together, its creak a lullaby that carried memories of her laughter. The city was behind me, its skyscrapers a testament to the empire we had built. But here by the lake I was just Leo, a man who loved fiercely and fought for what mattered. The events of the wedding replayed in my mind, each moment a stone in the path that led me here. Preston's humiliation, the cake, the laughter, the cruel lie at the rehearsal dinner, had been a calculated assault designed to erase me from Chloe's life. His plan to seize the timber house, to lock me away in Golden Meadows, was a desecration of everything I held sacred. But the Sunset Protocol, activated with Evelyn's precision and Henry's unwavering support, had turned his greed against him. The revelation of his family's insolvency, the nullification of the prenuptial agreement, the donation of the wedding budget to the Isabella Morgan Foundation, they were not just acts of justice, but a reclamation of my dignity, a defense of the legacy Isabella and I had forged. Yet the victory was bittersweet. Chloe's silence, her refusal to speak as Preston's lies unraveled, was a wound that lingered. I had offered her a choice: to return to the truth, to the love that shaped her, or to stay with a man who valued her only as a means to an end. Her tear-filled eyes, her trembling hands had held a flicker of the girl I knew, but she hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. I had walked away not out of defeat, but out of faith. Faith that she would find her way back, that the values we instilled in her would outlast Preston's poison. Days turned into weeks, and the lake's glow never faded, its light, a quiet reminder of Isabella's presence. I returned to my routine, sketching blueprints for community projects, tending the garden where Isabella had once planted roses. The house hummed with her energy, the windows rattling softly on still nights, the air heavy with lavender. I felt her with me, not just in memory but in a way that defied explanation, a warmth in the breeze, a whisper in the creak of the floorboards. The blueprints on my desk continued to shift their lines, forming spirals that seemed to pulse with purpose, as if she were guiding me, still urging me to hold fast. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. My heart quickened, a mix of hope and dread, as I stepped onto the porch. It was Chloe's car, a sleek sedan that screamed Preston's influence, but she was alone. She stepped out, her designer coat replaced by a simple sweater, her face pale but resolute. Her eyes, red from crying, held a spark I hadn't seen in months, the spark of the girl who once saw stars in the lake. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking as she climbed the porch steps. "I'm so sorry." The words were a floodgate, releasing a torrent of tears as she fell into my arms. I held her, my own eyes stinging, the weight of her apology a balm to the wound of her silence. "I didn't see it." She sobbed, her words muffled against my shoulder. "I didn't see what he was doing, what I was becoming. I let him make me forget who I am." I guided her to the rocking chairs, the lake glowing behind us, its light casting gentle patterns on the porch. "You're here now," I said, my voice soft but steady. "That's what matters." She wiped her eyes, her hands trembling, and told me everything. How Preston's charm had blinded her, how his promises of a glittering future had dulled her sense of truth. After the wedding, when Evelyn's documents exposed his lies, he had unraveled, blaming her, his family, anyone but himself. The Vanderbilt empire collapsed under the weight of its debts, their name reduced to a cautionary tale. Chloe had left him not out of anger but out of clarity, seeing at last the man he truly was. "I thought I was building something with him," she said, her voice small but growing stronger. But it was all a lie. You were right, Dad. It's not about money, it's about love, about what Mom would have wanted. She looked at the lake, her eyes tracing the glowing ripples, and I knew she felt Isabella's presence too. The air stirred the scent of lavender, wrapping around us a silent affirmation that we were not alone. I took her hand, my fingers worn but steady, and told her the truth, not just about the sunset protocol, but about the life Isabella and I had built, the values we had tried to pass on. This house, I said, gesturing to the timber walls, is more than wood and nails. It's your mother's heart, our promise to you. It's yours, Chloe, when you're ready to carry it. Her eyes widened a mix of awe and guilt as she realized the depth of what I had protected, what she had nearly lost. We sat in silence for a while, the lake's glow softening as the stars emerged their light, a mirror to the fireflies we used to chase. The house hummed softly, its pulse a quiet song of forgiveness, of hope. I didn't ask Chloe what she would do next. I didn't need to. The spark in her eyes told me she was finding her way back not just to me, but to herself. The blueprints on my desk, the ones that shifted with Isabella's guidance, were no longer a mystery. They were a map, not of buildings, but of a future where love and integrity would endure. As Chloe drove away, promising to return, I stood on the porch, the lake's light fading into the night. The lesson of this journey was clear, etched in the pain and triumph of the past months. True power lies not in wealth or status, but in the strength to stand for what matters, to protect what you love, even when it hurts. I had built an empire not of steel and stone, but of values, honesty, loyalty, love. Preston had tried to steal that empire, to rewrite my story, but he had failed because my story was written in the heart of a woman who never left me, in the soul of a daughter who was finding her way home. The city skyline glowed in the distance, its lights a testament to the legacy Isabella and I had built. The timber house stood firm, its walls alive with her presence, its windows framing a future where Chloe could reclaim her place. I felt Isabella's hand in mine, not in flesh, but in spirit, a warmth that promised she would always be with me. The storm was over, and in its wake was a quiet peace, a certainty that love would outlast greed, that truth would outshine lies. I returned to my study, the scent of lavender lingering, and picked up a new blueprint. Its lines were simple, a plan for a small community center, a gift to the town that had sheltered us. But as I traced the design, the lines shifted, forming a spiral that pulsed with light, a final message from Isabella. I smiled, my heart full, and whispered, "Thank you, Izzy." The house hummed in response, its pulse a song of closure, of hope, of a legacy unbroken.